September 19, 1944. Luxembourg. Headquarters of the U.S. 12th Army Group. The maps are already on the table. No one is debating terrain anymore. The discussion has narrowed to a single question: whether the American advance toward Germany will bypass the forest on the border or go straight through it. General Omar Bradley is present. His staff officers are present. The alternatives have already been outlined. The forest can be isolated. German units inside can be cut off. The main advance can continue around it, preserving momentum and manpower. Bradley rejects that option. He gives the order to attack directly into the Hürtgen Forest. The justification is short and procedural. The Germans control the Roer River dams to the east. If the forest is left untouched, those dams could be opened. Flooding could halt any advance beyond the river. The forest, Bradley concludes, must be cleared first. There is no operational timetable attached to the order. No contingency if resistance proves heavier than expected. No defined threshold for withdrawal. The forest is treated as a prerequisite, not a risk. The decision is logged. The operation is approved. Infantry divisions are assigned. Armor support is nominal, despite terrain that nullifies it. Air support is accepted as limited. Artillery is assumed to compensate. No political authority intervenes. No higher command objects. The order does not require approval from Eisenhower, and none is requested. Within hours, movement orders are issued to frontline units. The 1st American divisions begin shifting toward a dense, elevated woodland that German forces have been fortifying for months. This is not framed as a gamble. It is presented as administrative necessity. The decision is final. From this moment forward, the campaign timetable for the American First Army is no longer driven by open terrain, broken German lines, or strategic momentum. It is anchored to a forest. At the moment Bradley issued the order, the military situation on the Western Front was unusually permissive. German forces were not positioned to force a frontal fight. They were retreating, reorganizing, and short of reserves. The American advantage was not local firepower. It was freedom of movement. The Hürtgen Forest did not block the road to Germany. It sat to the side of it. The main axes of advance toward the Rhine ran north and south of the forest, across terrain where armor, artillery coordination, and air support could be applied decisively. Bypassing the forest did not mean ignoring it. It meant isolating it. From a purely operational perspective, the German units inside Hürtgen were static. They were infantry formations designed to defend fixed ground, not to maneuver or pursue. If American forces had advanced past the forest and cut the surrounding road network, those units would have been trapped. Their supplies would have dwindled. Their artillery would have lost observation. Their defensive value would have declined with each passing day. This was not theoretical. The U.S. Army had already used this method repeatedly since the breakout from Normandy. Strongpoints were bypassed. Pockets were reduced later. Momentum was preserved. Casualties stayed lower than German losses. Time worked for the attacker. The Roer River dams were real assets, but they were not an immediate operational trigger. Flooding the Roer Valley would delay an advance, not destroy it. It required coordination, time, and intact command and control. Those conditions were already eroding under Allied pressure. Even if the dams were opened, the effect would have been temporary and geographically limited. There were other tools available. The dams were fixed targets. Air power existed specifically to neutralize fixed targets. American bombers were already striking rail yards, bridges, and industrial nodes deep inside Germany. The dams were not beyond reach. They were simply outside the framework Bradley chose to use. The forest itself offered no decisive advantage to the Germans unless it was attacked directly. Its defensive power came from forcing the attacker into close contact, denying maneuver, and compressing combat into narrow trails and clearings. If left alone, it was a liability, not a shield. German units inside could not project power outward. They could only react inward. Operationally, the risk lay not in bypassing Hürtgen, but in entering it. Every known factor favored the defender. Restricted visibility nullified American artillery spotting. Dense canopy interfered with air support. Armor could not deploy off-road. Infantry assaults would have to move uphill, along predictable routes, into prepared kill zones. None of this was hidden. Terrain maps showed it clearly. After-action reports from earlier forest fighting in Europe had documented the same effects. The environment was not unknown. It was simply accepted. At that moment in September 1944, the U.S. Army possessed speed, supply dominance, and initiative. German forces possessed none of those. Military logic favored maintaining that imbalance. The opportunity was not to win the forest. The opportunity was to render it irrelevant. Once the order was given, that opportunity closed. The warning did not come from hindsight. It existed before the first American rifle company entered the trees. General George Patton did not need reconnaissance flights or after-action reports to recognize the problem. He read the same maps Bradley did and reached a different conclusion. To Patton, the forest was not an objective. It was an obstacle that favored the defender and punished the attacker. His assessment was blunt and consistent with how he had fought since North Africa. Patton believed speed destroyed German resistance faster than firepower. He believed fixed defenses were invitations to maneuver, not challenges to frontal assault. When shown the Hürtgen sector, his reaction was immediate. He argued that attacking the forest directly would consume infantry without producing operational results. He did not dispute the existence of the Roer dams. He disputed the method chosen to deal with them. His proposal was procedural, not dramatic. Bypass the forest. Advance around it. Seal it off from resupply. Keep pressure on the German rear areas. Use air power to neutralize the dams if and when necessary. Force the Germans to choose between holding an irrelevant patch of terrain or abandoning it to deal with a collapsing front elsewhere. This was not bravado. It was a continuation of methods Patton had already used successfully. In France, his army had repeatedly ignored fortified towns and wooded strongpoints, cutting roads and forcing German units to withdraw or surrender without costly assaults. He understood that German infantry formations, once isolated, lost cohesion quickly. They were dangerous only when the enemy chose to fight them on their terms. Patton's warning was not delivered as a public challenge. It moved through staff channels. It appeared in planning discussions. It was framed as an alternative, not a rebellion. He was Bradley's subordinate, and he respected the chain of command. But he did not soften his assessment. A direct assault into the forest, he said, would trade American casualties for ground that had no independent value. Other officers echoed parts of that concern. Corps-level planners noted the terrain restrictions. Intelligence summaries described extensive German field fortifications. Reports from earlier engagements in European forests warned of artillery airbursts, limited visibility, and disoriented units. None of this contradicted Bradley's fears about the dams. It challenged the assumption that the forest had to be cleared immediately and by infantry assault. Bradley acknowledged the risks. He did not deny them. His response was administrative rather than analytical. The forest lay on his axis of advance. Leaving enemy units on his flank was, in his view, unacceptable. The possibility of flooding, however limited in duration, represented uncertainty. Bradley preferred certainty, even if it was costly. Patton viewed that preference as a flaw. He had seen how German forces exploited hesitation. He believed delay was more dangerous than calculated risk. In his view, committing divisions to a terrain fight that neutralized American advantages was not caution. It was inertia disguised as prudence. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouted arguments, no formal dissent recorded. The warning passed, was considered, and was set aside. Bradley did not counter Patton's logic with evidence that the forest could be taken quickly or cheaply. He did not establish limits on the commitment. He simply reaffirmed the decision. Once that happened, Patton's role ended. He did not interfere. He did not leak objections. His army continued operating elsewhere, constrained by supply allocations he did not control. The warning remained on record only as an alternative never chosen. What followed would not be a surprise to those who issued it. It would be a confirmation, unfolding slowly enough to avoid immediate scrutiny, but relentlessly enough to consume everything sent into the trees. The warning had been clear. It had been ignored. The overruling did not arrive as a dramatic intervention. It emerged through silence, priority decisions, and institutional alignment. Once Bradley committed to the forest, the system moved to protect the commitment rather than reassess it. Eisenhower did not issue an explicit directive ordering the assault to continue. He did not need to. Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group. Within Allied structure, that authority was sufficient. What mattered was not whether Eisenhower agreed tactically, but whether he chose to interfere. He did not. There were reasons for that restraint, and none of them were rooted in terrain. By late 1944, Eisenhower's primary responsibility was not battlefield optimization. It was coalition stability. British and American forces were advancing under a fragile balance of prestige, command authority, and political expectation. Bernard Montgomery remained a constant problem. He demanded resources, questioned strategy, and carried the weight of British public opinion behind him. Eisenhower needed an American counterweight who was reliable, compliant, and politically safe. Omar Bradley filled that role. Bradley did not challenge Eisenhower in public. He did not appeal to Washington over his commander's head. He did not cultivate journalists. He absorbed pressure rather than generate it. Within the Allied system, that made him indispensable. Removing him, or even publicly questioning his judgment, would have created a vacuum Eisenhower could not fill with Patton. Patton was operationally aggressive and often correct. He was also politically radioactive. His history of disciplinary scandals, public statements, and open contempt for allies made him unacceptable as a stabilizing figure. Elevating Patton would have solved one military problem and created several political ones. Eisenhower understood that clearly. As the Hürtgen casualties mounted, the reporting structure worked in Bradley's favor. Losses arrived in increments. A regiment here, a battalion there. No single day resembled a catastrophe. There was no airborne disaster, no encirclement, no dramatic collapse that demanded explanation. The fighting was slow, grinding, and easily framed as attrition. Attrition was familiar. Attrition could be justified. Staff officers at higher headquarters saw casualty numbers, but they also saw progress measured in yards, villages, and grid references. Maps changed color slowly. That visual reinforcement mattered. It created the appearance of forward motion even as divisions were being hollowed out. Supply decisions reinforced the commitment. Ammunition, replacements, and fuel continued to flow into the sector. Each delivery made withdrawal less likely. To stop the operation would have required Eisenhower to acknowledge that months of effort had been misdirected. That acknowledgement would not remain confined to military channels. It would reach London and Washington. At the same time, Montgomery's failures created a perverse incentive to shield Bradley. Market Garden had collapsed publicly and quickly. It had embarrassed the alliance. Eisenhower could not afford another headline failure tied to an American commander. Hürtgen, by contrast, unfolded in obscurity. It did not threaten ports. It did not endanger capitals. It could be buried in communiques. There was also institutional bias at work. American doctrine at the time favored clearing flanks and securing terrain. Bypassing strong points was acceptable in fluid pursuit, but less so near national borders and river lines. Bradley's reasoning aligned with that doctrine. Patton's did not. When doctrine and hierarchy align, dissent becomes easy to dismiss. No formal review was convened. No pause was ordered to reconsider objectives. The assumption hardened that the forest had to be taken because it was already being fought over. The cost, once paid, became justification in itself. By November, the operation had acquired its own momentum. Divisions rotated and not because success was imminent, but because previous units had been destroyed. Relief became continuation. Continuation became obligation. To stop would mean admitting that the sacrifices already made had been unnecessary. Eisenhower was informed. He was not ignorant of the losses, but from his perspective, the alternative paths were worse. Challenging Bradley risked destabilizing American command cohesion. Removing him risked empowering Patton. Publicly acknowledging error risked eroding confidence at a moment when German resistance, though weakening, was still capable of surprise. So the system absorbed the losses and moved forward. Bradley was not shielded by a single decision. He was shielded by a structure that valued predictability over correction, loyalty over adaptability, and political balance over operational clarity. The overruling, in the end, was not of Patton's advice. It was of the idea that battlefield outcomes alone determined accountability. Once that principle was set aside, the forest ceased to be a tactical problem. It became an administrative one. And administrative problems, once accepted, are allowed to consume whatever is required to make them disappear. The consequence unfolded slowly enough to escape immediate judgment, but not slowly enough to spare the men sent inside. Once the first divisions entered the Hürtgen Forest, The pattern established itself and never changed. Units advanced a few hundred yards. Contact was made. Casualties spiked. Progress stalled. Relief units replaced shattered battalions and repeated the same movement along the same trails into the same fire. The terrain dictated everything. Visibility collapsed to meters. Command and control degraded almost immediately. Radios failed under canopy and terrain. Officers lost orientation. Platoons became isolated without knowing it. Attacks lost cohesion before they reached their start lines. German defenses did not need to maneuver. They waited. Their artillery did not target ground positions. It detonated above the trees. Shells burst in the canopy, turning wood into shrapnel. Splinters fell vertically into foxholes, into helmets, into exposed necks and shoulders. Cover became a liability. Digging deeper did not help. American artillery could not respond effectively. Observation was impossible. Fire missions were delayed or misdirected. Air support rarely appeared, and when it did, targets were indistinct. The forest absorbed American advantages and returned nothing. Casualties accumulated without spectacle. A company reduced to half strength was replaced by another. A battalion ceased to function and was absorbed. A regiment lost its officers and continued under temporary command. Reports moved upward stripped of detail, summarized into numbers. By early November, the scale became undeniable at lower levels. The 28th Infantry Division entered the forest with expectations of limited resistance. Within days, it was destroyed as a fighting force. Over 6,000 casualties in less than a week. Entire battalions ceased to exist. Survivors withdrew in fragments, carrying wounded through mud and broken trees under fire. The division's red keystone patch earned a new name among the men. Bloody Bucket. It was not gallows humor. It was accounting. Instead of halting the operation, higher command rotated in replacements. The shattered division was sent to what was described as a quiet sector to recover. That sector was the Ardennes. The forest fighting continued. The 4th Infantry Division followed. Then the 9th. Then the 8th. Each encountered the same conditions. Each suffered the same outcome. Ground gained was measured in yards and abandoned under counterattack. Villages captured at dawn were lost by nightfall. The map advanced, then receded, then advanced again over the same ground. Time became the hidden casualty. 5 months passed. Supplies were consumed at rates more typical of major offensives. Fuel, ammunition, and replacements flowed into terrain that produced no strategic breakthrough. Those resources were not abstract. They were finite, and their absence was felt elsewhere. While divisions were fed into Hürtgen, other formations waited. Mobility stalled. Opportunities closed. German units outside the forest regrouped, rebuilt, and redeployed. The Allied advance slowed not because of German strength, but because of American fixation. By December, the casualty count had crossed 25,000. No objective tied directly to the Roer dams had been secured. The dams remained in German hands. The forest remained contested. The original justification for the assault remained unresolved. Then the Germans moved. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched their counteroffensive through the Ardennes. Not through Hürtgen. Not against the sector where American strength had been concentrated for months. They struck where American lines were thin, quiet, and assumed safe. The units holding that sector were under strength. They were recovering. They had been bled elsewhere. Among them was the 28th Infantry Division. The division that had been destroyed in the forest was now responsible for holding ground against a mass German attack. It lacked manpower. It lacked cohesion. Its officers were new. Its soldiers were exhausted. When German armor and infantry broke through, resistance collapsed quickly. The initial German success in the Ardennes was not an accident of weather or surprise alone. It was enabled by the condition of the American forces facing it. That condition traced directly back to months spent grinding divisions into the Hürtgen Forest. The irony was complete. Bradley's fear had been flooding behind his advance. Instead, the flood came from the front. The forest he had insisted on clearing played no role in stopping or shaping the German offensive. It had absorbed American strength without influencing the decisive moment. Only after the Ardennes crisis stabilized did the forest finally fall. By then, it no longer mattered. German forces withdrew as part of a broader retreat. The dams were eventually neutralized. The advance resumed not because the forest had been conquered, but because German capacity to resist elsewhere had collapsed. The final accounting was brutal. Approximately 33,000 American casualties. Comparable German losses. No strategic breakthrough. No operational necessity fulfilled. Yet there was no reckoning. Bradley was not relieved. He was not censured. He was not questioned publicly. Reports framed the battle as difficult terrain, stubborn resistance, unavoidable cost. Responsibility dispersed upward and outward until it dissolved. In contrast, when Montgomery spoke too freely, consequences followed immediately. Careers trembled. Diplomatic cables flew. Eisenhower drafted relief orders over words spoken at a lectern. Hürtgen produced no such reaction because it lacked a moment. It lacked spectacle. It lacked a single decision that could be isolated and condemned. It was a prolonged expenditure, and prolonged expenditures can be normalized. The men who died there did not do so in one dramatic failure. They died incrementally, replaceably, anonymously. Their losses did not threaten alliance cohesion. They did not embarrass command structures. They did not force intervention. That was the true consequence of the decision. The forest did not just kill soldiers. It concealed responsibility. The post-war record did not reopen the case. It closed it quietly. When the war ended, attention moved quickly to victories that fit a cleaner narrative. Normandy, the breakout, the Rhine crossing, the Battle of the Bulge. The Hürtgen Forest did not integrate well into that sequence. It sat between triumph and crisis, unresolved and uncomfortable. In official histories, it was compressed into a difficult phase rather than examined as a decision. Bradley's own memoirs treated the forest cautiously. He acknowledged the fighting was brutal. He emphasized weather, terrain, and German resistance. He did not frame the operation as a strategic error. He presented it as a necessary precondition imposed by geography. Responsibility was diffused into circumstance. There was no detailed defense of the decision to persist for 5 months. There was no explanation for why alternatives were rejected. The Roer dams remained the justification, even though their impact on the campaign proved marginal and temporary. By the time they were neutralized, the main German threat had already shifted elsewhere. Official U.S. Army histories followed the same pattern. Casualty figures were recorded. Unit movements were described. Tactical difficulties were noted. But the central question, why the forest was assaulted repeatedly rather than bypassed, was left largely unexamined. The operation was presented as an unfortunate necessity rather than a contested choice. The absence of controversy mattered. Bradley emerged from the war with a reputation for steadiness and restraint. He was described as a commander who minimized risk, protected his men, and avoided unnecessary flamboyance. That image hardened quickly in the post-war years and went largely unchallenged. Promotion followed. Bradley was elevated to 5-star rank. He became the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His authority extended into the shaping of post-war American military doctrine. The Hürtgen Forest did not obstruct that ascent. Montgomery's post-war reputation followed a different path. His failures were debated openly. Market Garden became a case study. His press conference was dissected. His personality became inseparable from his record. He retained status, but not insulation. Patton's record froze at the moment of his death. His warnings about Hürtgen survived only in fragments, staff recollections, indirect references, and retrospective analysis. He left no post-war memoir to press the issue. Without him, there was no advocate to challenge the official framing. Declassified documents added detail but not revision. They confirmed casualty figures. They confirmed the length of the operation. They confirmed that alternatives had existed. But they did not produce institutional self-criticism. By the time those documents surfaced, the reputations involved were already fixed. The U.S. Army had little incentive to reopen the matter. The forest did not represent doctrinal failure as the institution defined it. It represented perseverance under adversity. That interpretation aligned with Cold War narratives about endurance, discipline, and resolve. The men who fought there left a different record. Veteran accounts were consistent. They described confusion, futility, and repetition. Many stated openly that the forest should never have been attacked as it was. Their testimonies circulated quietly, outside the official canon. No board of inquiry was convened after the war. No command review reassessed Bradley's judgment. The casualties were absorbed into aggregate totals, where they lost specificity. In the historical ledger, The Hürtgen Forest became a battle without a verdict. It was neither celebrated nor condemned. It existed as a footnote between larger events. That outcome was not accidental. The system that protected Bradley during the war continued to function after it. Political utility, institutional loyalty, and narrative convenience outweighed forensic accountability. The absence of a single dramatic failure allowed the decision to dissolve into process. In post-war memory, errors were associated with spectacle. Quiet attrition did not qualify. As a result, the forest was remembered as harsh terrain rather than a command choice. The suffering was attributed to nature and enemy determination rather than persistence in a flawed approach. The record closed without formal judgment, not because the evidence was unclear, but because the structure that would have judged it had no reason to do so. The case closes with no ambiguity. The decision to assault the Hürtgen Forest was not forced by the enemy. It was chosen. Alternatives existed, were understood, and were rejected. The losses that followed were not sudden or unforeseeable. They accumulated over months, in full view of the command structure that sustained the operation. Omar Bradley was not ignorant of the cost. He was not misled about the terrain. He was not deprived of other options. He persisted because persistence was institutionally safer than correction. The forest became a place where accountability dissolved into procedure. Dwight Eisenhower did not intervene, not because he lacked authority, but because authority carried political consequences he chose not to incur. Bradley was stable, compliant, and useful. Removing him would have destabilized American command balance and elevated a figure Eisenhower could not control. The system rewarded reliability over results. The men who paid for that calculation did not fail. They executed orders repeatedly under conditions that nullified their training and equipment. Their losses produced no decisive outcome. Their endurance became the justification for continuing the very approach that destroyed them. After the war, nothing corrected the record. Promotions proceeded. Reputations hardened. Official histories minimized causation and emphasized inevitability. The forest was framed as difficult ground rather than a sustained error. That framing was the final act of protection. Hürtgen did not become infamous because it lacked drama, not because it lacked meaning. It killed steadily, quietly, and without forcing a crisis. In an alliance governed by appearances and political equilibrium that made it survivable for those responsible. The judgment, viewed with distance, is straightforward. A flawed decision was preserved by institutional convenience. Political stability was purchased with infantry divisions. Responsibility was diffused until it disappeared. The war moved on. Careers advanced. Families buried the cost. The file is closed. If this investigation clarified something that history often blurs, subscribe to the channel to follow future case files. If you want to register your position on this decision, leave a comment.